Welcome to Influence, a book lovers podcast hosted by book besties Tegan and Amanda.
Here at Influenced, we cover books we've been influenced to read thanks to the internet, as well as books that have influenced us.
This podcast will talk about books ranging in age demographics, including adult content. Plus, we've been known to swear a time or two, so keep that in mind in case you have others around you. With that said, we're happy you're here.
We were influenced to read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which was released in 2017 by Washington Square Press. The audiobook is 12 hours and 10 minutes at normal speed. This book has been picked up by Netflix for a movie adaptation, and it is in its early development stages. I am so excited for this. Jessica Chastain has been probably the most fan-cast person in this movie to play Celia. However, she has said that she is not involved in this project, which is really sad because she literally is the best person that could play this character.
The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is one of 4 books written in the same world with overlapping characters. This is something that Taylor Jenkins Reid has done with her novels, and I personally think it is brilliant. I love it. So this book, Daisy Jones and the Six, Malibu Rising, and Carrie Soto is Back all take place in Hollywood throughout the last 50 to 60 years, and some of the characters show up in all of these books, and I think that's a lot of fun. This one in particular was inspired by some Hollywood icons, including Elizabeth Taylor, who was married 8 times to 7 different men, Ava Gardner, who revealed her secrets to a journalist, which is part of the plot with Evelyn Hugo. Also, Rita Hayworth, whose father was a Spaniard, and Tab Hunter's autobiography depicting what life was like for the LGBT community in Hollywood. So if you haven't read this book yet, no worries. We will start with a spoiler-free overview and give you a fair warning before we get into too much detail.
The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is a historical fiction novel about Monique Grant, and she is specifically requested to meet with the legendary Hollywood actress Evelyn Hugo, who has not done an interview in 20 years. The meeting request ends up being a little more than meets the eye. Evelyn wants Monique to write her life story and Monique to sell it after she dies. And keep the money? But why her? She's a low-level writer still working her way up the ranks. But with an agreement in place, Evelyn dishes to Monique about it all. The good, the bad, the ugly. Monique thinks the juiciest thing that she's going to find out from Evelyn is which husband did she love the most. But Evelyn had more in store for her. While Monique gains an enticing story, she gains her own lessons from Evelyn. Between Monique's own impending divorce and gaining her self-confidence, Evelyn's story is one to make a lasting impression. This story is told from a first-person perspective from 2 characters, both Monique and Evelyn, and there is a little sprinkling of a second-person perspective in one specific area of the book written for its own effect.
It's time for us to give our star ratings of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. How do we rate our books? It's great that you asked. We both have a similar star rating format. 5 stars, it was perfect. 4 stars, nearly perfect. 3 stars, it was good. 2 stars, it was bad. We really didn't like it. And 1 star, you're probably never going to hear us talk about that on here because we likely DNF'd it. Personally, I gave this one 5 stars. I am a huge fan of Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've read several of her books, and this one has been my favorite. I think it does a really good job of portraying Evelyn as a real human who is dynamic with character flaws and is someone who is relatable, if not personally, then in the aspect of we've all known someone similar.
I gave this a 4.5 out of 5. I have to agree with everything that Tegan just mentioned. It is a great book. I have not read any other Taylor Jenkins Reid books, but I am really excited to now because I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and it's different than I would typically read. It sat on my shelf for I want to say 2 years before I picked it up. And the only reason why I picked it up was because of this podcast, but I am so glad that I did, and I'm going to have to explore more. The only reason why I deducted half a star is a little spoilery, so I'm not going to say that here. But if you've read the book and continue listening on, I will go into later in this podcast why I took half a star off of it.
If you did read this book and enjoy it, we have some similar reading recommendations that we think you might enjoy as well, including Anything Else by Taylor Jenkins Reid, Hollywood Park by Mikkel Gillette, which is an autobiography about growing up in Hollywood and some of the toxic aspects of that. Also, I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. That's another autobiography about some of the toxic aspects of Hollywood, especially pertaining to self-image and trying to uphold beauty standards. And then also A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara.
This is the part of our journey where we do more of a deep dive into the story, so this is your spoiler warning. If you have not read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, now is your time to stop listening if you do not want the ending spoiled. But if you don't mind spoilers, by all means, join us further.
As always, we will start our deep dive portion of this episode with our favorite exercise of describing all the characters in 3 words. Today we're going to describe Monique, Celia, and Evelyn. So starting with Monique, I picked adrift, open-minded, and kind as my descriptors.
I love that we have a similar mindset because I also put open-minded in Monique's description. We don't look at each other's notes prior to these episodes. We try to do them as blind as possible, and we just plan what topics we want to talk about, and that was one where we're just overlapping, and I love it because it just means that we have the same brains sometime. I also put dynamic and brazen. There were very many aspects in that book that kind of surprised me about her, and she was very, very brazen in some of her actions, you know, likely from Evelyn.
Yeah, that's a great word.
So for Celia, this one I struggled with. I love Celia's character, and she was a much more complex character than I ever expected, so I had a really hard time narrowing it down to 3. But the 3 that I did come down to were loving, down to earth, which might be cheating a little bit, and jealous.
Okay, yeah. I think those are good picks. Celia was a little bit harder to describe because we don't get her perspective or her point of view in the book at all. We just see her through Evelyn's lens and the way that she reacts to certain situations. So definitely more of a challenge there. But I settled on passionate, supportive, and free-spirited.
Oh, free-spirited for sure. That one's spot on. Okay, now for our main girl, Evelyn.
Yes, for Evelyn, I put complicated, methodical, and reflective.
I think you might have been a little kinder about Evelyn than I was. I put manipulative, hungry, and powerful.
Ooh.
But I think that goes into the complex dynamic that Evelyn is. I know personally, I really struggled to like her. It took me quite a while to even get there. I had a lot of understanding as to why she did the things that she did, but maybe it's just me as a person, the idea of manipulating other people very blatantly and being just accepting of it goes against the grain of who I am. But I'm also not in that industry, especially in that time with her background and who she is as a person and her sexual identity. That's a really hard time that I can't relate to. So I try to give her a little leeway there. But then I had a lot of hard times with the fake miscarriages and the lying there to get what she wanted. To me, that was a bit of a line that was crossed, and that's why I struggled there. but I think she grew on me, and I got there in the end to realize, okay, she's not perfect, no one is, and I think there's some lessons to be learned.
Yeah, that really goes along with what I was saying earlier about Evelyn just being this really dynamic character. She was super frustrating at times, but overall, I had a lot of sympathy for her because she really went through it. I mean, her mother died when she was young. Her father was sexually and physically abusive, I mean, probably emotionally too, right? She was sexualized by the industry at a really young age and learned to use her body and her sexuality for power. So I think going through all of that, she sort of had a warped sense of success and power. But in the end, I think she learned a lot from the way that she lived her life and the relationships she had with people. She became really reflective in the end and had a lot of regrets.
Yeah, ultimately, she did what she needed to do to, one, survive, and two, make it through the industry that would have eaten her alive in any other situation. And that included marrying several different men in order to get what she wanted. Let's go through a quick overview of Evelyn's husbands. So first was Ernie. It was her first marriage at 15 years old, and she essentially married him for a ride to Hollywood. And then she married Don, a fellow actor, and this was helpful to both of their careers, but she also had feelings for Don. But he ultimately expected her to give up her career to be a mom, and he became abusive and cheated on her. Ultimately, she faked 3 different miscarriages for the press prior to divorcing him. Then there was Mick. He was a elopement in Vegas that was annulled the next day. It was meant to distract the press from her relationship with Celia as they were getting a little closer to what was going on with her. Then there was Rex, who was a co-star in a movie, and she got married to boost box office sales. This was just an agreement between the two of them that this was a marriage for convenience and they would never sleep with each other and that they could be with whoever they wanted as long as they didn't get caught. And then we have Harry. Evelyn and Harry were married essentially to help with their ruse, right? Celia and John were married, so this allowed them to essentially see each other, Celia and Evelyn, and then John and Harry, to spend the nights with each other and not have that press attention on them. Now, it ended up being where there was a rumor that they were swingers, but even then, that was more acceptable society for them to be perceived as swingers rather than monogamous and queer. Nonetheless, Harry and Evelyn end up having a biological child together because they both wanted families. After Harry, we have Max, who was one of Evelyn's directors, and this was the man that Evelyn thought she had feelings for, and then very quickly learned that Max just loved the idea of using Evelyn as arm candy, essentially. But during their time together, Evelyn was able to reconnect with Celia and then ultimately divorced him. And then lastly was Robert, who was Celia's brother. She married Robert only so that Celia could leave her estate to Evelyn without the risk of it being rejected, as Celia battled emphysema. So Tegan, that is a long, long list of husbands, one I cannot relate to, but who is your favorite?
Harry, obviously.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's the only right answer, right?
It really is. It was a beautiful storyline with Harry to tell the fact that sometimes friendship can be stronger than romantic attraction. But I also have to shout out Rex in this. This was a husband I didn't expect to enjoy so much, but there was just something wonderful about this mutual agreement between two similar, like-minded people that wanted to use each other to bolster their careers and had no qualms about it and just were on the same playing field. But then I also love that they were both willing to take blame at the end of the marriage when Rex wanted to get out and marry the woman that he actually fell in love with. And I don't know, there was just something about that was so respectable, and I felt like they grew from each other in just a great way.
Yeah, I did have a lot of respect for Rex, especially there at the end, because he was the one who wanted to break off the agreement because he had fallen in love and the woman he loved was pregnant. So he wanted to move on and start a family, right? But he wasn't just like, yeah, Evelyn, I'm gonna, let you take the blame for this one. No, he went to her and he said, we went into this agreement together. We're gonna get out of it together. And I thought that was really honorable of him and showed a lot of integrity.
I thought that was also a great growth moment for Evelyn, because prior to him, there was a lot of do what she wants to do and take no prisoners for it, which worked well for her. But this was a good moment where she realized, well, I care about him and I don't want him to be impacted by the decisions I've made too. I thought it was just a good growing up moment for our main gal. But that girl had some untrustworthy moments if you were on the outs with her, which makes you wonder if this situation with Monique and telling her story, her life was so full of lies and deceit. So I think there's this kernel of you as the audience wondering, well, is this book also full of lies and deceits, or is she a trusting storyteller?
My take on this, and this is a very Tegan answer, was that Evelyn is as trusting and reliable as anyone can be, because we all have our own biases and we view ourselves from a different lens than other people do, right? Like sometimes we have this impression of our own character and we'll hold ourselves in a little bit of a higher regard. And if somebody comes to us with some feedback or some criticism and says, hey, I don't like this aspect of your character, I think you need to work on that. Sometimes we'll get defensive because we don't see ourselves that way. But the bottom line, what it comes down to is my actions and my behavior have given that person that perception of me. So
that is the most Tegan answer, to just be like, well, kind of not. It's the middle of the road.
Yeah, I believe that Evelyn believes she is a reliable narrator.
That is the most PR answer I've ever heard, and I love it.
I do have a communications degree.
And it is shining through.
Well, what is your cynical answer to that?
I actually was a little more positive about this. I kind of was a little skeptical at first and was like, she's gonna play this up to her advantage. Like, this is the whole lesson. She's just teaching everyone a lesson that you take what you want. But then we get into her story more, and she showed some credibility in some of the vulnerability, particularly about Monique's father, and the willingness to share that story gives her that extra credibility, I think, that shows she's being truthful here. And various times, even prior to the reveal that was the ending with Monique's father, she says multiple times, don't try to paint me as a hero. Paint me in the way that I was, and I did some really terrible things. So that also leans towards some credibility. But I would think that her story would be even more interesting to get the perceptions and perspectives of those she impacted, both good and bad.
That would be really interesting to see. How did Harry perceive her? How did Celia perceive her? How did her several husbands perceive her throughout time? But you did bring up a really good point about her sharing the truth with Monique. Evelyn's been holding on to that secret for years, And if she's willing to come clean to someone about the secret that she would have otherwise taken to her grave, I think that does show some credibility on her part.
I do think Celia's perspective in Evelyn's biography would be a huge storytelling aspect, because Celia's perception, especially around Evelyn and their breakups, probably have different opinions based on what side you're on, and you can kind of understand both sides of it. So did you agree or disagree with Celia in the two instances that she left Evelyn?
I could understand why Celia left her. I mean, Evelyn did some shitty things, right? And we all have our limits of what we're willing to tolerate. But I felt like there was such poor communication around both of these instances, where if maybe Evelyn had been more upfront about her intentions, and or they, talked it out and had a mature conversation about expectations of each other and why certain things were inappropriate or unacceptable in their relationship, they could have saved themselves a lot of heartbreak and saved themselves from wasting so much time apart.
She, I don't think, handled it well, but I understood where she was coming from. But I also think both her and Evelyn had a lot of growing up to do still, a lot of hard lessons that they still needed to learn, and were both a little selfish because they were young and naive and trying to be successful, trying to have their relationship, trying to have a private life and wanting it all. And unfortunately, that was just not the case for them. And so they still had to learn where that balance was and what those lessons associated were. And they just weren't ready to be together. And then it's just tragically sad when they finally are ready to be together and it's such limited time. The biggest frustration, though, I had with Celia was her overt jealousy of men and the lack of understanding about Evelyn's sexuality and being attracted to both, because that was just ultimately unfair to Evelyn. And Celia wanted Evelyn to be all of hers, but they have to keep it a secret, which means Evelyn might have to do some unsavory things, and Celia as well. I think that responsibility could have fallen both ways to try to protect that relationship in ways that were a little unsavory to the relationship.
Yeah, I think they had a hard time understanding that about each other and kind of boxing each other in. Like, Evelyn was attracted to men and women equally, but I remember a part when Evelyn and Celia were on a break from each other, and Evelyn was following her and seeing, who she was spending her time with, and had made a comment that if Celia was spending her time with another woman, she would be jealous because she knew that that might mean something to Celia. But if she was with a man, then Evelyn would know it didn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
And Celia couldn't do the same for Evelyn, right? There was reason for her to be concerned regardless of the sex of who Evelyn was spending time with. So you mentioned they both had a lot to learn and some growing up to do before they were able to be with each other and have a healthy relationship. Evelyn did learn a lot throughout her life. Were there any pieces of advice or lessons that you agreed or disagreed with?
I took a lot of annotations and notes during my read on this on my Kindle because there were just so many good nuggets in here. One of them being, quote, "People think that intimacy is about sex, but intimacy is about truth. When you realize you can tell someone your truth, when you can stand in front of them bare, and their response is, 'You're safe with me,' that's intimacy." I loved it. It shows that intimacy goes far beyond just physical attraction. And I think that's why I loved Harry and Rex so much, is because there was this friendship there and this intimacy that just borders beyond the physical attraction. Also, I loved heartbreak is loss, divorce is a piece of paper. because that cracked me up, and it stood out to me and made me laugh as a child whose parents got divorced, they got remarried, it was a thing. I could see where that divorce was more just a legality thing, and the heartbreak was the hard part.
Yeah,
Ultimately, it's that people can be good and bad all in one. We are not black and white. Everything is shades of gray, and we as people are that way as well. We have good and we have bad.
Well, there were several idioms sprinkled throughout this book, and I had intended to make note of all of them, but I was reading the physical book, and I don't do such a good job of making note of that on the physical book because I don't want to like mark up and annotate my physical books. If I'm reading on Kindle, it's easy because I can just highlight it and then it's right there in my notes. But the one that is standing out in my memory the most is the one where she was talking about how beauty is similar to a flower, where if some people see that beautiful flower and think, oh, that is so pretty, I am just admiring its beauty, and I'm going to leave it right where it is so it can continue to be nurtured and continue growing. And other people will look at that flower and say, that is a really beautiful thing. I want to take it for myself. And it becomes about possessiveness. And so they will like pluck the flower out of its environment where it is being nurtured and flourishing, and they will take it for itself, and it ultimately ruins it. So that's what's standing out to me the most as far as the idioms go. But I would just say overall, the summary of what I felt I could take away from Evelyn's lessons was just that all the day-to-day bullshit doesn't matter in the end. Like, the people that we love matter, and cultivating relationships matter. But all that small stuff in between that we spend a lot of time stressing out about, how are people perceiving us? What are people going to think? None of that matters.
1,000%. Life is short, and you have to enjoy what makes you happy. Be with the people that make you happy. Don't spend your life wondering the what ifs and thinking, should I or shouldn't I?
Unfortunately, Evelyn spent so much of her life like changing herself in order to control the optics and to be successful in Hollywood. Like, she altered her appearance. She pretended to have hobbies that she wasn't really interested in. She changed to the way she talked. And I think she even like made up a different story about her childhood, and then just coming up with a PR spin for absolutely everything, especially her relationship with Celia. Like, that came up over and over again, where she thought, oh, I can't let the press know that I'm in love with a woman. So she ended up marrying all these guys that she didn't have any intimacy with.
That had to have been so much work and effort and energy to put into all of that spin and narrative.
Mm-hmm.
We live in a day of social media, instant gratification. Everything's at the palm of our hands and at a touch with our thumbs. And it makes me wonder, do you think that in this day of social media that spinning a story would be as easily possible?
I do. In ways I think that it might be easier, just because with globalization and social media and how quickly you can get information out, I think instead of spending all of this time very carefully constructing the narrative that you're going to put out there, if you're trying to cover something up, just throw out a few different stories, and social media is going to pick that up and spread it, and people aren't going to know what's true versus what isn't true.
I'll agree with you to an extent, but I do think that it would take even more work than it would have taken before, because everybody has a cell phone nowadays. So if you are a public figure and you're out and about, everybody is able to take their spin on any action that you take and thus push it out as well. But I think it takes even more work and even more purposeful energy toward it because everybody has a phone.
That's true. It would be easier for people to capture those moments, and pictures speak louder than words. So putting that out there, people are going to draw their own conclusions pretty quickly. So yeah, I think it would be harder to hide information, but easier to create distractions.
We have to address it now. The ending and the twist of this book. Were you expecting that? What were your original guesses? Because mine were not very spot on at all.
Mine were not spot on either. I think I'm a terrible guesser
Same.
about plots for books.
Same.
Initially, I was thinking that Evelyn had picked Monique because they were related somehow. Like, I thought maybe Monique was, her daughter who had been put up for adoption.
Yes. Yes.
And I believed that for a long time, especially after Evelyn found out she was pregnant. Oh, this is it. Like, this is going to be Monique. But then she went to Mexico and had a real abortion. But even in my head then, I was thinking, oh, well, maybe there's another pregnancy later.
I kept waiting for that same storyline, and then I was like, oh no, that's not happening. I also then kept going toward, well, what's her motivations for writing this book? Like, she's got to be sick or she's got to be dying. Otherwise, why would she tell the story now? So I was pretty adamant about that, which we find out, sure enough, she's sick with breast cancer like her daughter was. Because of Monique's article about death with dignity, I figured that had to tie in. So my guess was that she would either want Monique to help her commit suicide, or that she was relating to Monique and she was going to admit that she helped her daughter commit suicide at the end of her cancer journey. Now, both of these are wrong. The one with Evelyn being the closest to, we actually find out that Evelyn plans to take her own life and Monique does not stop her. But the biggest twist, and this is why I took a half star off, was about Monique's dad. In the story, Harry is killed in a drunk driving accident, and we come to find out that the passenger killed in the car that Evelyn brings to the driver's seat and shifts the blame to was actually Monique's father. I loved the twist. I think it was a great twist. But the reason why I had to take a half star off it for myself was the beginning and the narration of Monique's father led me to believe that it was like a type of illness, which is why I thought maybe she wrote her article the way she did, and that it never led to something being sudden. I would have liked to have had some sort of narration saying that this was an unexpected death or a car crash. Leave the drunk driving out of it, leave all of the potentially spoilery things out in the beginning, but just enough to make you realize when you read the twist happening, like, oh my god, I should have put 2 and 2 together. Because car accidents are such a common thing. Unfortunately, drunk driving accidents are a common occurrence that more than likely, at least I assume, people may not have pieced that together because they happen far enough apart in the story. So that was the only reason why I had to take a half star off.
I totally get where you're coming from with that. But at the same time, I really appreciated being completely thrown off and having no inkling of a suspicion about that at all.
I'm just picky. I love twists and surprises, but I love twists and surprises that you as a reader realize I should have caught onto that. I should have connected this thing and there were the signs and I didn't pick them up.
That's fair. That is totally fair. And I will say, initially when Monique's dad was introduced, it sounded like he was still alive. And then when we learned that he wasn't alive or he wasn't around anymore, it sounded like it was more of a recent thing. Not that he had died when Monique was, I think it was 7 years old. So I do feel like if that was maybe a little bit misleading, but my impression of it without, reading anyone else's reviews or or taking in anyone else's perspective, was just that the author gave us a little bit of a surprise by omitting information.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what was happening here. Still a great ending. I loved it. That was just more of my personal preference. So do you think Monique will tell her mom? Because we find out that she has not told her mom about her dad and who he was and what actually happened to him. But she's going to write this book.
Nope, no way.
You don't?
I don't think she's going to tell her mom.
Oh, I do.
No.
I do. I think she will, it'll come time to publish this book, and she loves her mom and her family so much and knows her mom would probably want the truth and not to be blindsided by this book coming out. I think she'll tell her.
I think when she publishes the book, she's going to keep her dad as an anonymous love interest for Harry. And the reason I think that she's not going to tell her mom is because she had this conversation with her mom about their marriage, what that was like. And her mom painted this picture of them being really happy together. Even though it wasn't a very sexual relationship, he was so good to her and so sweet to her and just really prioritized and loved his family. I think she's going to let her mom hold on to that.
I just don't think she will. I think that will be I actually think that that's a catalyst into why she might. Because there was also this line about how devastated and how confused they were because he was never one to go drink and drive, and this was such unexpected behavior for him. And it almost tarnished that perception of him and kind of put a mark against his name, and I think she'll want to try to clear that mark.
You have a good point there. I hadn't considered that about how her mom might perceive her dad thinking that he caused a drunk driving accident. Ugh. Now I'm conflicted, but ultimately I still think she's gonna want to let her mom hold on to those like feel good memories.
And I will say, in your defense of this, that would be outing her dad in maybe a way that he never wanted to be, and that even in death may not be fair to him. So I think that could be a point in your favor that she's not going to say something. That's a tougher question than I expected it to be.
That is a really tough question.
Then
you will have to reach out to Taylor Jenkins Reid and ask her.
Can we get some? Can we just get an epilogue chapter, please?
Yes, in your head, how did you picture this playing out?
I want to know. So as always, we like to end this with our favorite moment of the book. There was lots of great moments that we've talked about, but ultimately I want to know, what was your favorite moment?
This might surprise you because typically I pick a really romantic moment. Not in this book. In this book, my favorite moment was actually when Evelyn went to Harry's grave after Celia was buried.
Oh, that moment was heartbreaking. Just
it absolutely was. And even though that was really heartbreaking and a really heavy moment, it was my favorite point in the book because I think that was really a turning point for Evelyn, where she finally realized what she valued in life and how she wanted to live differently going forward. Because here she was grieving the person, well, the two people in her life that she loved the most at that time, right? She was grieving Celia, the love of her life, and also realized that her best friend, the person that she was able to share everything with, Harry, was not alive anymore either. I think that really flipped a switch in Evelyn and changed her.
I don't cry much in books, but that one had me tearing up. My favorite moment was with Monique when she was advocating for herself between the magazine, but then also against Evelyn. She takes Evelyn's advice and stands up against the magazine saying this is what she's going to do and sets her foot down and sets her demands. But then she also goes and does the same thing to Evelyn, and she takes her advice and kind of flips a 180 on her and says, okay, I'm going to take your advice, I'm going to learn from you, and now you get to deal with the repercussions of what you've taught me, and here are my demands now too. And I just loved it. It was that brazen moment that I described with Monique.
She realized she had leverage, and with that leverage came a little bit of power, right? And didn't she say something along the lines of, I have to Evelyn Hugo or something like that?
Yeah, I have to pull an Evelyn. She basically made her name into a verb. Okay, that is all we have for our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts on the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. If you would like to connect with us, please consider following us on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @InfluencedBookPodcast. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate us wherever you get your podcast.
We look forward to our next episode when we will be discussing One Dark Window by Rachel Gillick. Until next time, happy reading!